Signs of trouble. It all began in the summer of 1985, in the remote, sleepy town of Evergreen, nestled among the sprawling plains of Montana. Evergreen had always maintained a reputation for its stunning natural beauty and serenity, a place where life moved at a laid-back, almost dreamlike pace. In this corner of quiet America, the last thing anyone expected was a nightmare unfolding right at its heart. Theragen Labs. Theragen Labs wasn't the type of place anyone would bat an eye at. It was a modest-sized biotechnology research facility situated on the edge of town, its sleek glass and metal structure standing in stark contrast to the rustic wooden houses that dotted the surrounding landscape. Most locals didn't even know exactly what went on behind its tightly secured doors, only aware that the lab employed some of the town's brightest minds and ambitious transplants from nearby cities. If anything, it was a source of quiet pride, a cutting-edge lab in their humble little town. But everything changed when whispers turned into headlines. Employees at Theragen began complaining of vague but alarming symptoms: unrelenting fatigue, persistent headaches, and nausea that no medicine seemed to touch. At first, these issues were written off as nothing more than the consequences of long hours and high-pressure work. After all, the biotech industry was no stranger to burnout. Yet the symptoms refused to subside. Worse, they started escalating. What began as minor aches and discomfort soon snowballed into something terrifying. A lab technician reported sudden patches of hair falling out while combing. A junior researcher had recurring episodes of intense vomiting and dizziness. Another employee showed up at the local clinic paralyzed from the waist down overnight, unable to explain why. Doctors remained baffled, unable to connect the dots. It wasn't until a senior biochemist, a methodical and disciplined veteran named Dr. Martin Green, collapsed while running routine lab tests, that the rumors officially took hold. Something dark was happening inside Theragen Labs. Initially, the leadership at Theragen moved swiftly to reassure employees and the public that everything was under control. "There's no cause for concern," the head of public relations declared in a community press conference, smoothing over any mention of the spreading illnesses. Unbeknownst to anyone listening, the rot ran much deeper than they imagined. What truly unsettled staff within the facility was the unpredictability of the symptoms. Unlike a viral outbreak where patterns typically emerge, this mystery illness seemed to pick its victims at random. One week, it was an intern who doubled over in pain. The next, a seasoned IT technician suddenly developed tremors so severe he couldn't type. Yet, there were no outward indicators of contamination. No spilled chemicals, no suspicious fumes, no anomalies in the lab equipment. Whatever was plaguing Theragen's workforce was as elusive as it was insidious. The breaking point came on a fateful June morning. Robert Tully, a respected figure in the company and the head of the toxicology division, walked into work with a confident smile as usual. By mid-afternoon, his smile was gone, replaced by shallow breaths and cries of agony. His colleagues watched in horror as Robert dropped to the floor, clutching his back in excruciating pain. He didn't make it past the night. Robert's shocking death acted as a grim catalyst, jolting everyone into awareness. It wasn't just a workplace fluke anymore, it was personal. Fear gripped every corner of the lab, from the brightly lit research stations to the cramped break rooms where, just weeks earlier, laughter had echoed freely. Employees immediately started scrutinizing their surroundings and their habits, speculating wildly. Some stopped using the shared coffee machine, convinced it was contaminated. Others pointed accusatory fingers at the industrial air filters hanging menacingly overhead, believing toxins had been silently pumped into the building. And yet, the cause of this silent epidemic remained shrouded in mystery. Medical professionals brought in for independent testing were stumped, offering no clear diagnosis or consistent pathology. Any attempt to make sense of the chaos simply led to more questions. Why were only certain individuals falling ill? Why did symptoms vary so drastically between cases? And most terrifying of all, who or what was causing it? Meanwhile, townsfolk in Evergreen began to gossip. Rumors simmered and swirled around the diner counters and on dusty porch steps. It wasn't uncommon to overhear snippets of conversation. "You heard about those scientists over at Theragen? It's cursed, I tell you." Some speculated it was a chemical spill the company was hiding. Others invoked outlandish theories of government experiments gone awry. Evergreen's once idyllic image began to sour, overshadowed by the growing sense that something truly sinister was at play. By early July, at least 15 employees had succumbed to debilitating bouts of illness, while 3 were hospitalized in critical condition. Whether driven by fear or desperation, several staff quit their jobs outright and left town, unwilling to stick around for something they didn't know how to fight. But for those who stayed, life at Theragen became a relentless game of survival, where every sip of water, every touch of a keyboard, and even the air they breathed felt fraught with invisible danger. Looking back, the tragedy at Theragen could have been seen coming from miles away. The signs were there, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the disease that was spreading, it was the creeping realization that nothing at the lab was as secure or as transparent as it seemed. And in the days to come, the truth behind Evergreen's nightmare would prove far darker than anyone could have imagined. The first death. It was June 17, 1985, a Monday like any other at Theragen Labs. The morning was calm and employees shuffled into work carrying coffee cups and briefcases, ready to tackle the long day ahead. Among them was Robert Tully, the company's seasoned toxicology expert. At 59 years old, Robert was the kind of man that younger employees respected and leaned on for guidance. His thick glasses and salt and pepper hair gave him a look of quiet wisdom, and his unshakable professionalism made him a cornerstone of the lab's culture. To those who knew him, Robert was more than just a colleague. He was a mentor, a symbol of stability in an environment often defined by uncertainty. That morning, Robert greeted his team with his signature warm smile. Engaging in casual conversations, he reassured the nervous interns still adjusting to the high-stakes nature of their work. But by mid-afternoon, something changed. His vibrant demeanor began to wane, his energetic pace replaced by lethargy. He excused himself from a team meeting, clutching at his lower back and wincing slightly. When a lab technician asked if he was all right, Robert downplayed his symptoms, attributing them to a bad night's sleep and insisting he'd feel better after getting some fresh air. But the fresh air outside did little to ease his discomfort. Within hours, Robert's condition deteriorated further. His back pain intensified to the point that he couldn't straighten his posture. His hands trembled as he tried to pick up a pen, and beads of sweat began rolling down his forehead. By late afternoon, he was walking unsteadily down the lab's main corridor, struggling to maintain his balance. As his colleagues looked on alarmed, Robert collapsed suddenly, clutching his chest and groaning in agony. The room fell silent, and for a moment no one moved, frozen in disbelief at the sight of their once vigilant co-worker crumpled on the floor. Then panic erupted. One researcher ran to call 911 while others knelt beside Robert, trying desperately to assess his condition. His shallow breaths and pale complexion painted a grim picture. When EMTs arrived minutes later, Robert was barely conscious. As he was loaded into the ambulance, his co-workers stood helplessly behind, their faces etched with worry and fear. The thought that someone as resilient as Robert could fall so suddenly shook everyone to their core. What on earth had caused this? At St. Albans City Hospital, Robert was rushed into the intensive care unit. Doctors quickly took note of his unusual symptoms, not just the excruciating pain in his back, but also a sudden onset of partial paralysis in his limbs, slowing heart rate, and widespread muscle weakness. It was as if his body were shutting down piece by piece. Initial tests ruled out a cardiac event, leaving physicians baffled. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't stabilize him. By 11 p.m. that night, just hours after leaving his workplace, Robert Tully succumbed to what medical professionals called an unidentifiable acute condition. The news of Robert's death spread rapidly among Theragen staff. The office that had once buzzed with the energy of scientific discovery now buzzed with unease and whispered questions. How could a man like Robert, seemingly in good health, meet such a sudden and unexplained end? And if it could happen to him, could it happen to one of them next? To most of the Theragen team, Robert's death felt like a blow that came out of nowhere, a cruel and random event. But to a select few who had been paying attention, it didn't feel quite so random. Over the past few weeks, there had been murmurs of strange illnesses spreading throughout the lab. Several employees had reported feeling unusually fatigued, some suffering from persistent nausea without any clear cause. A few had even taken sick days, complaining of flu-like symptoms that they couldn't shake. These incidents, though minor at the time, now took on a far more sinister significance. When Robert's immediate supervisor, Dr. Philip Drexler, reviewed the events of that day, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of guilt. A few days earlier, Robert had confided in him about experiencing mild stomach pains and increasing fatigue. He'd even taken 2 sick days earlier that month, something completely out of character for a man who prided himself on never missing work. But like so many others, Philip had dismissed these complaints as simple overwork. Now, looking back, he wondered, had he missed the warning signs? The greater concern came when hospital staff couldn't provide closure. Preliminary autopsy results were inconclusive, and the toxicology report showed no traces of any known poisons or contaminants. It was as if Robert's body had spontaneously and inexplicably turned against him. Without answers, speculation began to run rampant. Some theorized that Robert had been exposed to a rare pathogen in one of the lab's biohazard rooms, though regular checks revealed no breaches in protocol. Others whispered that his death might have been triggered by a new compound being researched behind closed doors. For Dr. Drexler and other senior leaders at Theragen, the unknown was the most frightening element of all. Every safety mechanism they had in place seemed intact, every standard operating procedure followed to the letter, yet none of it had been enough to save Robert. The question that lingered in everyone's mind was chilling. If even the most rigorous safeguards couldn't prevent this, what chance did the rest of them stand? Back at Theragen, Robert's empty desk became a haunting reminder of his absence. The mug he usually sipped coffee from sat untouched beside a neatly stacked pile of lab reports. His coat still hung on the back of his chair, as though he might walk in at any moment to grab it. But deep down, everyone knew that Theragen Labs had changed forever. Robert's shocking and untimely death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Little did they know, it was only the beginning. The outbreak. In the days that followed Robert Tully's death, Theragen Labs descended into a whirlwind of confusion and fear. It seemed like every corner of the lab harbored danger and uncertainty. His death was tragic enough, but it was what came next that pushed the entire facility into crisis. More employees started falling ill, at first with minor symptoms, but things quickly escalated in ways no one could have anticipated. It began subtly, with whispers of fatigue and discomfort spreading among the staff. Employees who were otherwise vibrant and full of energy began to complain of weakness that wouldn't go away, headaches that seemed to pound relentlessly, and stomach issues that turned simple meals into grueling ordeals. What stood out most was the inconsistency in symptoms. For some, the illness felt like a nagging flu, while others experienced something much more alarming. One technician noticed significant hair loss upon waking, realizing piles of strands had collected on her pillow. Another employee developed tremors in his hands so severe he couldn't hold a pipette, a fundamental tool in his work. At first, these cases were dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. Stress, one supervisor said. Maybe dietary issues, suggested another. The prevailing opinion was that the high-pressure work environment of Theragen Labs must have been taking its toll. But the explanations stopped holding together as new symptoms began cropping up, symptoms no one could rationalize away. The incidents grew stranger and scarier by the day. Laura Mackenzie, a young intern on her first big assignment, collapsed in the break room with a scream that echoed down the sterile white hallways. She later described, through tears, an unbearable burning sensation spreading down her spine seconds before losing consciousness. Meanwhile, Patrick Eng, an IT personnel who rarely even entered the lab's biohazard zones, began complaining of numbness in his legs. Within a matter of hours, Patrick was confined to a wheelchair, unsure if he'd ever walk again. The randomness of the outbreak made it all the more terrifying. It wasn't restricted to a single department, nor did it appear to be related to specific tasks or experiments. Lab researchers, office assistants, and even janitorial staff were all falling ill. The only common thread seemed to be that everyone worked under Theragen's roof, and that fact alone was enough to turn the building into a breeding ground for paranoia. In a matter of weeks, the number of reported cases climbed to alarming heights. By early July, 15 employees had either resigned or were hospitalized for severe symptoms. Descriptions of their plight varied widely: vomiting, fever, partial paralysis, disorientation, rashes breaking out in strange patterns across the skin. Some even described strange auditory hallucinations, as if hearing phantom voices just beyond their range of understanding. For those who remained at work, it felt like the invisible threat could strike anywhere, anytime. The lab became an uneasy and hostile environment. Meetings were hushed, conversations at the water cooler replaced by worried glances. Employees began pointing fingers and speculating wildly. Was it the air conditioning system recycling toxic particles? Had the lab's cafeteria been contaminated? Could the drinking water supply have been tampered with? People even avoided touching door handles directly, or lingered in hallways instead of sitting down in communal areas. The ever-present hum of laboratory equipment felt more oppressive than comforting. Every spill, every small accident was examined with suspicion. New protocols were hastily put into effect, Gloves and masks were distributed, and areas of the building were cordoned off for safety. None of it helped. Employees continued to fall ill, and no one could figure out why. For many, nighttime offered no respite. Victoria Hall, a project manager who had outwardly appeared healthy, came into work one day with dark circles under her eyes and a shaken expression. She confided to her colleague that, the night before, she had experienced excruciating pains in the middle of her chest, which left her gasping for air. "I thought I was dying," she admitted, only to be comforted by a coworker who replied, "You're lucky, at least you didn't wake up bald this morning." Desperation led to increasingly odd behavior among staff. Some refused to eat or drink anything prepared in the company kitchens. Others brought their own bottled water and refused to use office supplies, convinced the staplers and pens carried some sort of agent infecting them. Rumors soon began swirling about employees sneaking unauthorized personal protective equipment, face shields and hazmat suits, into their workstations. People took longer and longer breaks outside, lingering in the parking lot under the blazing Montana sun, rather than risk another moment within Theragen's facility walls. No one wanted to be the next Robert Tully. Beyond the walls of the lab, word of the outbreak began spilling into the community. Evergreen wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed buried for long. The local diner bustled with theories. "It's gotta be chemical leaks. Didn't they have some fancy toxicologist on staff?" one mechanic muttered over a coffee cup. "What about radiation or even biological weapons? Companies like that can't be trusted," another offered in a low voice. Parents began forbidding their children from playing anywhere near the complex, terrified some invisible contamination might slip into their homes on the breeze. News stations picked up the story when the third patient was admitted to St. Albans City Hospital in critical condition. Reporters painted vivid pictures of mysterious illnesses and suits being filed against Theragen for negligence. A local journalist even explored the possibility of the facility hiding government-funded experiments. Pressure on management mounted. Despite the rising tide of fear, the leadership team at Theragen remained eerily quiet. They issued routine statements expressing regret for the illnesses and promising thorough investigations, but otherwise avoided engagement with the public. Behind closed doors, the mood among executives was frantic. Safety audits were initiated, consultants were brought in, including renowned toxicologists and virologists. Rooms were scrubbed, air ducts sealed, and major equipment overhauled, but none of it explained what was happening to Theragen's employees. Each new case tightened the noose of dread around the remaining staff. By mid-July, working at Theragen wasn't just a matter of doing your job, it felt more like survival. The hope of pinpointing the cause, however slim, was the only thing driving some employees to walk through those glass doors every morning. And yet for others, hope was long gone. They saw the sickness not as a mystery to solve, but as an inevitable curse hanging over their heads. The sickness, they began calling it, like a force too impenetrable, too unfathomable to put into words. And as the fear grew, one single question echoed louder than the rest. Was this just the beginning? The investigation begins. By mid-July of 1985, the situation at Theragen Labs was no longer manageable. Employees were falling ill at an alarming rate, and fear of the unknown permeated every corner of the facility. For every new case, the panic deepened. Some workers quit on the spot, abandoning their jobs and leaving the town for good. Others, despite their growing unease, stayed, tethered by contracts, financial obligations, or sheer curiosity about what was happening to their workplace. But as the body count continued to climb, Robert Tully's death being only the first of what would become many, the leadership of Theragen Labs could no longer afford to sit idle. The management team, led by COO Dr. Philip Drexler, a man known for his unflinching commitment to logic and data, called an emergency meeting in the main conference room. The mood was tense as department heads filed in, most looking visibly shaken by recent events. Conversations were muted and glances were exchanged with wary hesitance, almost as though each person feared the outbreak itself might be lurking somewhere in the room. "We need answers," Dr. Drexler began, his voice calm but strained with an undercurrent of urgency. "The speculation, the fear, the rumors, it all stops here and now. We're launching a full-scale internal investigation starting today." Theragen had never encountered a crisis of this magnitude before, but it wasn't without resources. The facility boasted advanced safety protocols, state-of-the-art equipment, and a team of some of the country's brightest scientists. If there was an explanation for the illnesses plaguing the lab, they were determined to find it. A team assembled. The first step was assembling an internal task force. It consisted of senior scientists, health and safety specialists, and toxicologists. In many ways, Dr. Drexler wanted this team to be the best of the best. But given that most of the senior staff was battling burnout, or worse, illness, the pool of available personnel was thin. Among those chosen was Dr. Emily Cartwright, an epidemiologist who had previously worked on studying the spread of rare infectious diseases, and Simon Vega, the head of environmental safety, whose expertise in air quality and contamination control gave the team an edge in assessing potential toxic exposures. "All right, everyone," Dr. Cartwright began during their first task force meeting, standing before a whiteboard filled with hastily scrawled notes. "We've got to treat this like an epidemiological puzzle. Symptoms are emerging randomly but seem to escalate disproportionately. Our job is to find patterns, no matter how small or obscure, and determine what links these cases." "I want a complete audit of workplace conditions," Simon Vega added, flipping through a clipboard stacked with incident reports. "Every laboratory, every workbench, every ventilation shaft. I want swabs. I want samples. Every material in this building needs to be tested for contamination." The staff who remained were ordered to comply with invasive medical examinations, prompted to submit their blood samples, hair specimens, and even fingerprint sweeps in case of any unknown chemical residue. The measures weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Some employees broke down in frustration, accusing management of violating their privacy. Others rallied against what they saw as arbitrary protocols, unable to shake the growing mistrust of leadership. "We're not the problem," one technician shouted during a heated exchange in the break room. "They've got us testing ourselves, but what about the corporate experiments? What aren't they telling us?" But it wasn't just the employees who were divided. Rumors within the task force soon began brewing as well. Some suspected that a critical lab experiment had gone catastrophically wrong and been quietly swept under the rug. Others whispered that the illnesses were the result of sabotage, pointing to the sharp rise of anti-science sentiment across the country. Could someone from outside have tampered with their systems? What if it was deliberate? The environmental angle. As the investigation pressed forward, Vega's team focused heavily on the physical environment of the facility. The lab's central HVAC system, the heart of Theragen Labs, was dismantled section by section, cleaned, swabbed, and reassembled only after microscopic testing revealed no evidence of contaminants. So too were the breakroom appliances analyzed. The coffee machines, microwave ovens, and even the vending machines received thorough scrutiny. Yet, every swab came back negative. "No airborne toxins, no industrial pollutants, none of the usual suspects," Vega muttered to himself, poring over the data. "We're missing something. We have to be." Their attention eventually turned to the lab's inventory. With dozens of active experiments involving chemicals, compounds, and biological agents, oversight over materials had been stringent, at least on paper. Logs of hazardous performance activities showed no breached containers or unaccounted-for samples. Still, Vega had an uneasy feeling. "Trace every item," he ordered his team. "Every column in our inventory list needs to be cross-checked. One misstep could explain everything." Local insights and whispers. Word of the investigation spread beyond the walls of Theragen Labs, fueling speculation among the townsfolk of Evergreen. Firefighters, who had long relegated the lab to a status of minor community curiosity, were now being asked in diners and grocery store lines about potential chemical accidents. Some of the older residents, those who still vividly recalled the Cold War years, whispered about the possibility of controlling experiments gone too far. Others spun wild theories about conspiracy, mutagenic bioagents designed for the military, or even accidental radiation leaks buried within the forested outskirts. For the investigative team, it didn't help that real information was scarce. Even local authorities had been reluctant to share details, unsure if panic control might worsen public unrest. The lab began restricting access to non-essential personnel, with private security guards stationed at every entrance. A startling discovery. It wasn't until the third week of the investigation that the task force stumbled across an unexpected anomaly. Evan Green, a relatively new hire at Theragen, had drawn the team's attention. On the surface, Evan seemed like your average junior researcher, quiet, observant, and keeping to himself. However, his proximity to some of the employees who had fallen ill raised eyebrows, and when inventory logs showed irregularities in his assigned projects, suspicions mounted. What was most unexplainable, however, was Evan's behavior in team meetings. In a particularly heated task force meeting, Evan posed a chilling question. "If none of the contaminants we're testing for exist in these environments," he began, deliberately scanning the room, "has it occurred to any of you that the illnesses may not be accidents?" Twice, Evan avoided requests to turn in his personal workspace for inspection. "Logistical confusion," he'd say with a shrug, or, "Oh, I thought I'd already done that." But it was enough for Dr. Cartwright to flag his file internally. On the final day of the investigation's third week, Vega was called urgently to the security department. "You need to see this," the guard on duty had said. "We found something odd on camera." It was grainy footage, but unmistakable. Late one evening, Evan was spotted wheeling a janitorial cart into a lab area marked as restricted. What followed was Evan meticulously opening a glove compartment and moving small, unlabeled containers into his jacket. For Vega and the rest of the investigative team, it was the first real lead, but it was also terrifying proof. Whatever was happening to Theragen's employees, Evergreen was no innocent bystander. The odd figure emerges. He had been there all along, yet no one had truly noticed him until the chaos began to unfold. Evergreen, a quiet and unassuming young man, was a junior researcher who had joined Theragen Labs just 6 months prior. His onboarding had raised no red flags. He had the right credentials, solid references, and a seemingly ordinary background. In a place like Theragen, where the hierarchy was steep and each department operated almost like a self-contained universe, Evan's silence didn't seem suspicious. He fit well enough into the backdrop, like countless other new hires who were eager to make a name for themselves. At least at first. In the aftermath of Robert Tully's death and the subsequent outbreak, Evan's name was barely mentioned. But as the illnesses spread and rumors churned, subtle details about him started to unsettle his colleagues. One of the first glimpses of oddity came during a routine all-hands meeting. Employees had gathered in the large conference room, tensions so thick they could practically feel the walls closing in on them. Most of them were either silently panicking or sparring angrily over safety protocols. But not Evan. While others whispered nervously about the outbreak, Evan stood out not for his assertiveness, but for the haunting calm he exuded. When the head of operations opened the floor to questions, a desperate attempt at transparency, Evan was the first to raise his hand. His voice, low and deliberate, cut through the room. "Are we absolutely certain the illnesses are unrelated to specific projects within this facility?" he challenged flatly, his eyes scanning the leadership table at the front of the room. "Or is there something specific we aren't being told?" His blunt question stunned the room into silence. Most employees were afraid to poke at the company's secrets, let alone insinuate something may have been deliberately hidden. There was something coldly direct in Evan's tone, something that felt confrontational without being outwardly rude. In ordinary circumstances, the question might have been dismissed as a frustrated employee blowing off steam, but coming from Evan, a man known for being awkward and reserved, it sounded like a loaded accusation. Several heads turned to get a better look at him, suddenly realizing how under the radar he had stayed up until this point. The unsettling observations. Over the following days, people began noticing Evan's presence more than ever before. There was something disquieting about his quiet precision, the way he moved about his work without any visible fear or distraction. While other employees were fumbling, shaking, and distracted by paranoia, Evan seemed almost unfazed. He often worked late into the evening, hunched over his station in a far corner of the lab, poring over files and handling samples with an unnerving meticulousness. Some began to notice odd discrepancies in his behavior. Evan was strangely well versed in toxicology, despite his role as a junior researcher focusing on biochemistry. He occasionally offered unsolicited insights during meetings with a confidence that felt unnatural coming from someone so new. More disturbingly, his knowledge often leaned toward obscure chemical interactions that even senior researchers would have to revisit their textbooks to confirm. "Wasn't he just a biochemist?" one analyst whispered to another during coffee hour. "Why does he talk about thallium compounds like he's been working with them his whole life?" Evan's actions didn't just confound his colleagues. They occasionally contradicted standard workplace etiquette. Twice a lab assistant caught him methodically inspecting the shared coffee machine when no one else was around. A security guard reported that Evan had tried to access areas of the facility that weren't part of his department's jurisdiction, explaining it away as a clerical error. He brushed it off with a sheepish smile, but the incidents lingered in the minds of those who noticed. Warning signs ignored. Most employees chose to brush off their discomfort with Evan, chalking it up to the heightened emotions that had overtaken the lab. After all, paranoia had become the default state of everyone working under Theragen's roof. But for a few, the pieces simply didn't add up. Evan Green supposedly came to Theragen Labs after completing a prestigious graduate program on the East Coast. Yet when one particularly paranoid project manager decided to probe further into his academic background, some discrepancies emerged. His thesis, supposedly focusing on biochemistry applications in pharmaceutical development, was nearly impossible to track down. Meanwhile, snippets of old online records seemed to imply Evan might have transferred universities several times before finishing his degree. No one knew what this meant, but it gave enough fuel for the fires of suspicion. "He gives me the creeps," admitted Victoria Hall, a project manager who had begun paying unusual attention to Evan's daily habits. She mentioned her misgivings to Simon Vega, head of the investigative task force, only to be met with a shrug. "It's probably nothing, but just watch him, you'll see what I mean." Still, there wasn't yet a concrete reason to link Evan Green to the illnesses sweeping through the lab. That, however, would change in one unforgettable moment. The suspicious janitorial cart. Late one night, security cameras picked up an unusual scene. The lab was nearly deserted save for a skeleton crew of overnight workers, most of whom were deep in the restricted biosafety zones. A single figure could be seen moving through one of the quieter wings of the building, Evan Green. At first there was nothing truly strange about the footage. Evan was pushing a janitorial cart, something that might normally be a red flag, but given the state of the lab during the outbreak, cross-department chores had become common. Yet, the camera lingered on him as he maneuvered his way toward a restricted access storage room, one meant only for senior-level personnel. Rather than swiping his card and walking in, Evan paused by the door for several moments, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly to ensure no one was watching. Then, with practiced efficiency, he retrieved a small keycard from his lab coat pocket, the kind issued exclusively to department heads. He slid it through the panel. The door clicked open and Evan disappeared into the room, his cart left stationed outside. When the task force reviewed the footage the next morning, the room burst into chaos. "He shouldn't even have access to that lab," blurted Simon Vega as he watched Evan expertly bypass protocol. Adding to the mystery was what the janitorial cart actually contained. Upon retrieval, the cart was found to hold nothing but cleaning supplies, or so it seemed. Tucked into the corner, however, was a barely perceptible compartment, hidden under layers of rags. Investigators were still trying to open it when Evan showed up for work later that afternoon, his expression unreadable. An ominous question. Perhaps the most chilling moment came during another team meeting later that week. When pressed by Dr. Emily Cartwright about his unusual nighttime activities, Evan tilted his head slightly and replied with a question of his own. "Do you think it's possible the illnesses aren't just accidents?" he asked, his tone eerily calm. "What if someone wanted them to happen?" For the few who heard that question, it was like a blast of cold air in the room. What Evan meant, or who he might have been implicating, was unclear. But one thing was certain: Evan Green was no ordinary employee, and he wasn't done surprising them yet. The truth finally unfolds. For weeks, the outbreak at Theragen Labs had been riddled with uncertainty and dread. People were falling ill with no clear explanation, rumors were flying, and the once secure halls of the facility had become a minefield of suspicion. But as the investigative team dug deeper, the layers of mystery surrounding the source of the outbreak began to unravel, one shocking truth at a time. The turning point came not from an official report or a breakthrough in testing, but rather from a slip in routine and a chilling discovery. By early August, the task force, under extraordinary pressure, had combed through Theragen's physical environment, medical records, and experimental logs. Yet the results were maddeningly inconclusive. No airborne toxin, pathogen, or chemical anomaly could account for the symptoms tearing through the workforce. It wasn't until Simon Vega received an unexpected call from security that the pieces began to fall into place. A hidden pattern. On a humid summer morning, Simon was called to the security office where footage from several nights earlier had been flagged by one of the guards. "We found something strange during a review," the guard informed him, his expression tense. As Simon leaned over the monitor, the grainy black and white footage played on the screen. It showed Evan Green, again. This time he wasn't discreetly moving through the halls as before. Instead, he was standing near the break room, meticulously pulling what looked like small, unlabeled containers from a cart, before pouring some of their contents into the water dispenser. Simon's blood ran cold. The previously innocent janitorial cart had reappeared, and this time it was not laden with cleaning supplies. On screen, Evan's movements were calculated, almost methodical, as he emptied a substance into the communal water supply. He wiped down the area with cloths, quickly pocketed his tools, and left without a trace. "This can't be real," Simon whispered as he stared at the screen, but he knew otherwise. The evidence was irrefutable. A haunting confirmation. Armed with the footage, the task force confronted Evan the following morning. It wasn't just his demeanor that chilled everyone in the room, it was his lack of defense. Evergreen, usually so reserved and inconspicuous, did not deny the accusations. Instead, he responded with something much worse. Curiosity. "You finally figured it out," he said with an unsettling calmness. The room fell silent, every breath seemingly vacuumed out as Evan's words hung heavy in the air. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that sent a shiver down spines. "Took you long enough." For Dr. Emily Cartwright, who had spent sleepless nights piecing together scattered data, the weight of the realization crushed her. "You poisoned them?" she asked, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. Evan tilted his head slightly, feigning innocence. "Poison's a strong word, don't you think? I'd call it an experiment." The apartment raid. With Evan now under full suspicion, law enforcement was brought in to search his apartment. The contents of his home shocked even seasoned detectives. What looked like a nondescript, sparsely furnished apartment turned out to be a front for a personal laboratory tucked behind a basement door. Shelves were stacked with vials of chemicals, some of which were identified as highly toxic: thallium, arsenic, and even traces of dimethyl mercury, a compound notorious for its lethal potency with just a few micrograms. What was most disturbing, however, was Evan's journal. Found at the edge of a cluttered desk, the black leather-bound notebook was filled with pages upon pages of neatly written notes. Dated entries matched the exact timeline of the outbreak, each detailing individuals who fell ill, their symptoms, their progression, and in some cases, their deaths. It was as if Evan had meticulously documented the impact of his actions, an experiment unfolding in real time. "I wouldn't touch that without gloves," one detective warned as the journal was slid into an evidence bag. A twisted revelation. Under questioning, Evan maintained a chilling composure. He confessed to everything, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no remorse, no cries of regret or panic. Instead, Evan spoke with the clinical detachment of a scientist analyzing data points. "They were perfect candidates," he explained, leaning back casually in his chair. "Diverse backgrounds, different genetic makeups, varying levels of health. A little bit of arsenic here, some thallium exposure there. You learn a lot when you need to." His reasoning sent chills through the investigators. To Evan, the employees of Theragen Labs were not people, they were test subjects, part of a meticulous experiment to refine his understanding of chemical toxicology. The illnesses, the deaths, the chaos, none of it was accidental. It was all part of what he considered revolutionary work. When asked why, his answer was alarmingly simple. "Because I could. Because no one ever notices the quiet ones." Connecting the dots. As investigators delved deeper into his past, they began uncovering a web of warning signs that had been missed. Evan had been a chemistry prodigy in his youth, winning countless awards in high school science fairs and earning scholarships to top-tier universities, but his academic career had been marred by sudden transfers and allegations of unconventional research practices. Records showed he had been expelled from a prestigious program after a series of rats in the university's laboratory died under mysterious circumstances. More troubling discoveries soon followed. Evan's former neighbors had filed complaints about strange fumes coming from his apartment, but local authorities never followed up. In one chilling case, a fellow bachelor's degree student had developed severe symptoms eerily mirroring those at Theragen. The student had almost died from arsenic poisoning but had no idea how they'd been exposed. Investigators now suspected Evan had been experimenting long before his arrival at Theragen. The aftermath. By the time Theragen's employees learned the truth, the damage had already been done. Evan's calculated experiments had wreaked havoc on the lab's workforce, leaving at least 20 people seriously ill and 3 dead, including Robert Tully. The lab shut its doors temporarily, and a nationwide investigation into toxic chemical handling policies was launched in response. Evan Green, however, was unbothered. At his arraignment, he seemed indifferent to the charges of murder, assault, and reckless endangerment. When asked if he had any final comments before being taken away, he smirked. "Do you know what the most fascinating part of all this is?" he said, looking directly at the judge. "I barely even scratched the surface of what's possible." A dark legacy. The truth about Evan Green's experiments left the town of Evergreen shaken. The people of the once idyllic Montana town were outraged, not only at Evan's crimes but also at the systems that had allowed him to flourish unchecked. Theragen Labs shut down permanently, its name forever tainted by the scandal, while federal regulatory bodies scrambled to close loopholes that had allowed a man like Evan to gain access to such dangerous resources. But the scars ran deeper. For those who survived the outbreak, life at Theragen would never be forgotten. Behind every handshake, every seemingly innocent smile from a coworker, they would always wonder, what secrets might someone else be hiding? Buried secrets. Even as Evan Green was taken into custody, there was an unsettling feeling in the air that his web of lies and manipulations went deeper than anyone could imagine. The surface of his crimes had been uncovered, but with every passing day, more was revealed, pieces of a puzzle that didn't just explain why Theragen Labs had been turned into a battlefield of sickness, but also how Evan had been able to deceive so many, for so long. To the world, Evan was simply a rogue scientist, a disturbed man who had let his genius twist into something monstrous. But to the investigators tasked with unearthing the full story, he was far more complicated than that. What they discovered wasn't just a story of a single man's cruelty, but of a systematic failure, hidden agendas, and negligence that allowed danger to grow unnoticed. The secret lab. As authorities dug through Evan Green's apartment, they stumbled upon what could only be described as a nightmare in disguise. Behind the facade of his plain one-bedroom rental, they found a concealed underground lab that Evan had spent months, perhaps even years, constructing. The space was meticulously organized, a cold, clinical environment that starkly contrasted with the sloppiness of the rest of his home. The walls were lined with metal shelves, stacked high with chemical vials, powders, and biohazard-labeled containers. Several jars contained murky liquids, the likes of which would require entire teams of forensic analysts to identify. A nearby desk was cluttered with notes, diagrams, and printouts from Theragen's internal systems, schematics, material inventories, and security clearance rosters that Evan should never have had access to. In the center of the lab stood a large freezer. When investigators opened it, they found an assortment of substances that had been stolen from Theragen Labs, advanced chemical compounds, rare toxins, and even live pathogen samples that were considered tightly controlled. Each item was carefully labeled, though many bore cryptic shorthand codes only Evan could decipher. But the most disturbing part wasn't the stolen materials, it was the experiments. In one corner of the room, authorities found a makeshift testing station, petri dishes, microscopes, and even the remains of small animals in sealed containers. Evan hadn't just been crafting poisons, he had been testing them. Each set of samples was paired with detailed notes about how the substances affected different organisms, carefully chronicled with chilling precision. The journal of a madman. If Evan's hidden lab painted the picture of a meticulous criminal, his journal revealed something much darker. Found on his desk amid the chaos, the leather-bound book held the key to understanding the mind of a man who saw himself as more than a scientist. He saw himself as an artist of destruction. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and timelines. Each entry provided a wealth of insight into how Evan had engineered the chaos at Theragen. Names of employees were listed with corresponding symptoms, precise doses of toxic substances, and the intervals at which they were exposed. He had been documenting their suffering as though it were a series of controlled scientific trials. Subject: Robert Tully. Status: deceased. Notes: initial dose was administered through direct contamination of water supply. Symptoms escalated as expected: fatigue, neurological degradation, eventual organ failure. Conclusion: dosage was optimal for demonstration of acute lethality. Potential modifications for prolonged exposure noted. The journal went on like this, detailing not only the victims but also Evan's grim satisfaction with the results. Beyond the clinical observations, fragments of personal musings were scattered throughout. They move through life oblivious to consequence. What if I could remind them how fragile they are? It's not destruction, it's progress. Every trial yields new data. They'll call me a monster, but who among them will ever understand the beauty of knowing how far you can push the limits? To Evan, the employees he had poisoned weren't co-workers or even human beings. They were variables, each one playing a role in an experiment he had deemed crucial to scientific advancement. How did it happen? As investigators combed through the mountain of evidence, they began to piece together the timeline of Evan's actions. It turned out that his entry into Theragen Labs had been carefully calculated. His credentials were legitimate. He had, in fact, graduated from a prestigious institution, but a deeper dive into his history revealed a pattern of disturbances that had gone unnoticed. During his university years, Evan had been expelled from 2 separate programs due to accusations of unethical behavior. One incident involved the unexplained death of lab animals, which Evan dismissed as a necessary risk for progress. Another saw him removed from a research grant after his colleagues raised concerns about his obsessive experiments on toxins. What baffled authorities was how these red flags hadn't stopped him from entering Theragen. It was clear he had exploited gaps in the hiring process. References had either been fabricated or else provided by former mentors who wanted to wash their hands of him. Once inside, Evan wasted no time building his framework for the disaster that was to come. Interviews with Theragen employees helped piece together the early stages of his deceit. Evan had volunteered for additional tasks, taken on after-hours work, and ingratiated himself with supervisors enough to gain access to restricted areas. To most, he seemed like a motivated, if slightly offbeat junior researcher. Behind the scenes, however, he had been siphoning small amounts of toxic substances from experiments, just enough to go unnoticed, but enough to stockpile an arsenal of poisons. The corporate cover-up. What made matters darker was the revelation that Theragen's leadership had overlooked more than they cared to admit. As investigators delved into the company's internal files, they discovered that there had been prior warnings about compromised inventory and protocol breaches. Anonymous reports had been filed months before the outbreak, noting unaccounted-for chemicals and irregularities in lab access logs. Yet these reports had been quietly dismissed, deemed either clerical errors or minor oversights. Even more damning was an internal memo unearthed by law enforcement, written by a mid-level safety officer shortly after Robert Tully's death. The memo explicitly raised concerns about potential internal foul play, and recommended halting certain operations until all substances and materials were accounted for. The response, from higher-ups? A single line scribbled across the bottom of the page. Noted, keep this contained. Theragen's executives, it seemed, had been more invested in protecting their reputation than their workforce. Some began to suspect that Evan's reign of terror hadn't been simply overlooked. It had been allowed to continue because no one wanted to admit the system had failed. A grim realization. As more layers of the story came to light, the haunting conclusion became clear. Evergreen had thrived in an environment where bureaucratic apathy and unchecked ambition created the perfect storm. Theragen hadn't just failed to stop him, it had enabled him. Evan's crimes weren't the work of a lone wolf operating in isolation. They were the result of a long chain of failures, a broken system that allowed one man's madness to slip under the radar until it was too late. The legacy of silence. By the time the investigation was closed, the damage was undeniable. Theragen Labs never reopened, its name now synonymous with negligence and tragedy. Federal oversight committees launched sweeping reforms aimed at preventing similar incidents, targeting everything from hiring practices to inventory control in high-stakes industries. But for the victims, the nightmare was never truly over. Survivors of the outbreak carried scars, both physical and emotional, that couldn't be erased by legislation or apologies. For them, the nightmare wasn't just about Evergreen, it was about the secrets that should have been uncovered long before he ever stepped through Theragen's doors. And for those who once called the town of Evergreen their home, one burning question remained. How many more Evergreens were quietly working in the shadows, just waiting to be discovered? A dark past. As investigators dug deeper into Evergreen's life, they discovered that the seemingly mild-mannered biochemist had lived a past filled with shadows, one littered with hints of brilliance twisted into something malevolent. Beneath his polished academic credentials and innocent demeanor lay the story of a deeply fractured individual whose genius had been warped by trauma, isolation, and an obsession with control. What became clear, even to seasoned law enforcement and psychologists, was that Evergreen hadn't simply snapped. No, what had happened at Theragen Labs had been brewing for decades, rooted in the dark depths of a past no one had cared to examine. A broken beginning. Evan Arthur Green was born on March 18, 1956, in a small industrial town nestled in the Rust Belt of Ohio. To outsiders, the Green family seemed ordinary. His father, Howard Green, worked long shifts at the local steel mill, while his mother, Margaret Green, stayed home to care for their only child. But behind closed doors, the picture was far from ordinary. Howard was a man driven by unrelenting discipline, a product of his own harsh upbringing during the Great Depression. He demanded nothing less than perfection, especially from his son. "Excellence isn't optional," became a mantra in the Green household, one that Evan heard daily, often screamed at him across the dinner table. Every mistake, be it a wrong answer on a math assignment, a scraped knee, or even a bad grade on a report card, was met with punishment. Margaret, soft-spoken and submissive, never interfered, simply standing by as Howard stripped Evan of any sense of safety or self-worth. One especially harrowing memory from Evan's childhood came to light during interviews with his former neighbors. At the age of 10, Evan had entered a local school science fair with a project on plant growth in controlled environments. His experiment, which involved monitoring the effects of light and water on seedlings, won second place. When Evan returned home with his silver ribbon, his father ripped it from his hands, crumpled it, and muttered, "Second place is for failures. My son isn't a failure." From that day on, Evan became obsessed with proving he was more than enough, not just to his father, but to anyone who might ever question him. Instead of rebelling against Howard's tyranny, Evan internalized it. He learned to hide his emotions, to swallow his frustration, and to focus it all on one outlet: science. The rise of a prodigy. Evan's brilliance became apparent early on. By the time he reached high school, he was working well beyond the level of his peers, earning accolades in chemistry competitions and science fairs. Teachers marveled at his ability to articulate complex chemical reactions with ease, and many encouraged him to pursue a career in research. But with his achievements came a darker side. While most kids his age worked in teams, Evan worked alone. He didn't want help. He didn't want collaboration. "Other people slow you down," he once told a chemistry teacher who tried to encourage group work. His classmates described him as brilliant but cold, intensely focused but distant. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his tone was sharp, dismissive, and almost condescending. Some of Evan's early experiments hinted at his growing fascination with control and his disregard for ethical boundaries. At the age of 15, he conducted a self-directed experiment on the effects of chemical fertilizers on insects using his family's backyard shed as a laboratory. When a neighbor's cat wandered into the shed and fell ill shortly after, rumors spread that Evan had been testing his chemicals on wildlife. He swore the incident was accidental, but whispers about his weird lab persisted for years. College years. Genius unchecked. Evan's academic journey took him to the University of Chicago, where he majored in biochemistry. It was there that his exceptional intelligence truly flourished. Despite his social awkwardness, professors admired his ability to view chemical interactions from unique perspectives. Evan didn't just understand biochemistry, one professor later recalled. He breathed it. But his brilliance came at a cost. While most students collaborated and formed study groups, Evan kept to himself, shunning campus life in favor of late nights in the lab. Former classmates described him as, "that guy who's always working but never talks to anyone." He had no known friends and instead poured all his energy into his research. It was during these years that darker incidents began to surface. In his second year, Evan was reprimanded by university officials after it was discovered that he had borrowed restricted chemicals from a lab without authorization. While he claimed he needed the reagents for a personal project, the university never determined exactly what he had been working on. A year later, several lab animals used for neurotoxin research turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. Evan had been the only student working with the chemicals in question, but no hard evidence tied him to the event. "There was always something off about him," recalled Greg Thatcher, one of Evan's lab partners who later dropped out of the program. "He didn't see the line between curiosity and cruelty. He used to say things like, 'Pain is just a side effect of progress.' Man, we should have seen it coming." A troubled career path. Evan's postgraduate career reflected a pattern of brilliance tempered by unpredictability. After completing his master's degree, he enrolled in a prestigious PhD program on the East Coast, only to be expelled a year later when his experiments came under ethical review. A whistleblower alleged that Evan had been conducting unauthorized tests on rats by exposing them to lethal doses of heavy metals, all without approval from the university's ethics board. From there, Evan drifted between research programs, moving from institution to institution. Wherever he went, he made an impression, not always a good one. Supervisors admired his intellect but found his methods troubling. He was known to ignore safety protocols, bypass guidelines, and conduct experiments that pushed moral and ethical boundaries. One of the most striking incidents came during his time at a pharmaceutical lab outside Boston. Evan's supervisor, Dr. Carol Metz, noticed discrepancies in the lab's toxicology reports shortly after Evan joined the team. Chemicals had gone missing from the inventory, and at least 2 junior lab assistants developed unusual symptoms, including fatigue and nausea. When suspicion began pointing toward Evan, he abruptly resigned, leaving no forwarding address. Despite these red flags, Evan's resume remained intact. He was careful to omit any mention of his disciplinary actions, and he always moved on before suspicions could solidify into formal complaints. By the time he applied to Theragen Labs in late 1984, he appeared on paper to be nothing more than a highly qualified, albeit introverted, biochemist. The making of a monster. Psychologists reviewing Evan's case later assessed him as a classic example of hidden psychopathy. His ability to compartmentalize emotions, paired with his obsessive need for perfection and control, made him exceptionally dangerous. He didn't see people as individuals, only as variables. Life, to him, was a series of experiments to be conducted and outcomes to be measured. Dr. Susan Partridge, one of the psychologists involved in the case, described Evan's personality. He wasn't overtly hostile, he didn't lash out or make threats, but he had a deep-rooted belief that he was superior, that he alone could see the truth others were too blind to understand. That's what made him so deadly, his complete detachment. When Evan arrived at Theragen Labs, the final domino had been set in motion. The company, too focused on hiring talent to dig into his past, gave him access to an arsenal of resources. For Evan, it was the perfect environment. A state-of-the-art lab, a naive workforce, and a management team too distracted by profits to notice the storm brewing in their midst. A past that should have been seen looking back. It was clear that Evan Green's descent into darkness wasn't an overnight transformation. The warning signs, the experiments, the cruelty, the disregard for ethics, had been there all along. Yet, no one had stopped him. Whether out of fear, negligence, or simple indifference, the world had allowed Evan Green to slip through the cracks. And by the time the truth came to light, it was far too late to undo the damage he had done. Cold calculations. Even as the weight of the investigation bore down on him, Evan Green remained disturbingly calm. While former colleagues at Theragen were grappling with the chaos and trauma left in his wake, Evan projected an air of quiet indifference. He didn't shout, panic, or flinch when confronted with the mountain of evidence detailing his crimes. Instead, he treated his interrogators and even his captors as though they were lab assistants, tools in his endless detached experiment. For the investigators, this lack of emotion was yet another unsettling piece in the puzzle of Evan Green. Many criminals, even the most calculating ones, eventually cracked under the pressure of being caught. But not Evan. His behavior was so devoid of humanity that interviewers couldn't decide if they were speaking to a man or a machine. Interrogation room ice. The scene could have been ripped straight from a modern crime thriller. Evan sat in the interrogation room with his hands cuffed loosely to the table. The overhead fluorescence cast a harsh glow on the polished metal surface, bathing the otherwise silent room in a cold, clinical light. Across from him sat Detective Robert Travers, a seasoned investigator who had cornered some of the most dangerous criminals in Montana. Yet, looking at Evan for the first time in a decade, Travers felt a chill run up his spine. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Travers asked, leaning in slightly, hoping to provoke even a flicker of fear or regret in the man across from him. Evan's lips twitched into a faint smile, more of a smirk, really, and he tilted his head slightly as if the question amused him. "Yes, murder, poisoning, assault, and some others, I imagine," he said in a voice void of passion, as though he were listing items on a grocery list. "But those are just labels, Detective. They hardly capture the reality of what I've achieved." Travers stiffened. "Achieved?" he repeated, his voice growing cold. "You call leaving 3 people dead and 20 others fighting for their lives an achievement?" "It depends on your perspective," Evan replied coolly, leaning back in his chair. "If you look at it emotionally, which I understand most people do, then yes, tragedy, loss, chaos. But if you look at it scientifically, as I do, it's progress. Every death, every symptom, every reaction, those are data points. They tell us how the human body interacts with precision-engineered toxins. Data, Detective, is invaluable." The room was silent for a long moment. Travers clenched his jaw, trying to maintain his composure. It was clear that Evan wasn't trying to antagonize him, he was simply stating what he saw as fact. That, more than any overt displays of evil, made him terrifying. "I'm not a monster." As the hours stretched on and investigators attempted to chip away at his calm demeanor, Evan revealed more of the warped philosophy that had guided his actions. He didn't deny the crimes. In fact, he spoke about them openly, almost eagerly, as if he were discussing a research paper. "People will call me a monster," he said at one point, his voice remaining eerily steady. "But they don't understand. What I did wasn't random, it wasn't malicious, it was methodical, necessary. Tests have to be conducted if we want to advance our understanding of the body, of chemicals, of mortality." Dr. Emily Cartwright, who had been called in to observe the interrogation, was horrified by the detachment in his tone. "You poisoned your colleagues," she said, struggling to keep the disgust from her voice. "People with families, friends." Evan turned his icy gaze to her, his expression void of guilt or remorse. "And? They weren't special, they were specimens like any other. You dissect cadavers in medical school, do you not? Are you burdened with guilt for cutting into them? The difference is, I worked with living subjects. It was messy, I'll admit, but far more educational." It was moments like these that defined Evan Green. He wasn't apologetic, nor was he sadistic. He didn't take pleasure in suffering, he simply didn't care. To him, human life was a resource to be studied, no different than beakers or petri dishes. Behavior behind bars. Evan's unnerving calm persisted even after he was formally charged and transferred to a holding facility awaiting trial. Unlike most prisoners, Evan didn't scream about his innocence, or try to negotiate for leniency. Instead, he spent his time quietly observing everyone around him. Guards, fellow inmates, even the lawyers who came to speak with him. "He's studying us," one guard later remarked. "Every time you walk by his cell, you feel like he's taking mental notes on you." Even the most hardened inmates kept their distance. Evan wasn't physically intimidating. His wiry frame and unassuming posture didn't suggest strength or danger, but it was the look in his eyes, sharp, calculating, utterly devoid of compassion, that unnerved them. "You'd almost rather someone try to pick a fight with you," said one inmate who shared a cell block with him. "At least you know what their deal is. But this guy? You get the feeling he could kill you if he thought it would make for an interesting experiment, and he'd sleep like a baby right after." The sociopath's courtroom. By the time Evan's trial began, the courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, legal teams, and psychologists eager to understand the man behind the crimes. Yet, even on the stand, with cameras pointed squarely at him, Evan retained his unnerving composure. His defense attorney attempted to argue that Evan wasn't fully aware of the consequences of his actions, portraying him as a misunderstood genius with a warped view of morality. But Evan undermined his own defense. When questioned about whether he regretted the suffering he caused, his answer was chilling. "Regret?" He cocked his head, as if the concept was foreign to him. "No, regret would imply that I was wrong. I wasn't. Everything I did to advance a broader understanding of toxins and the human condition. That's not something to regret. It's something to celebrate." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as his words sunk in. Evan's lawyer buried his face in his hands, realizing any chance of a not guilty plea was now dead. When the prosecution asked him if he had any remorse for the lives he ended, Evan gave a hauntingly simple response. "Why would I? They were variables in an experiment, calculating until the end." Even when the guilty verdict was announced, Evan sat motionless. He didn't flinch when the judge handed down the maximum sentence, nor when victims' families shouted at him from the gallery. To Evan, it seemed, the trial was just another step in a process he'd already accepted long ago. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, he wasn't afraid. As he was led out of the courtroom, one journalist called out, "Evan, any final words?" For a moment Evan paused, turning his head slightly toward the sound of the voice. A small smile crept onto his face as he replied, "The data was worth it." That was Evan Green, a man so cold, so detached, that even in his greatest moment of disgrace, he saw himself as nothing more than a scientist pursuing discovery. The aftermath. The courtroom may have delivered its verdict, but the ripple effects of Evan Green's crime stretched far beyond the walls of the courthouse. As the town of Evergreen and the broader scientific community grappled with the shocking revelations, a haunting reality began to set in. This was not just the story of one man's unthinkable actions, it was a mirror reflecting humanity's blind spots in science, corporate ethics, and our ability to see the darkness lurking in plain sight. Evan's actions left scars that reached deep, on individuals, on institutions, and on an entire industry desperately trying to save face. These were wounds that legislation, forensic investigations, or high-profile firings could never fully heal. The fallout at Theragen Labs, once a flagship for cutting-edge biotechnology, would never recover. The facility, once filled with eager scientists and the hum of advanced machinery, became a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Investigators combed through it for months, meticulously gathering evidence in the wake of Evans' crimes. They labeled everything from contaminated water tanks to misplaced lab chemicals, all of it a testament to the chaos that had unfolded within its walls. When the lab's doors finally closed for good, the building stood as a grim monument to corporate negligence. It became a site of whispered rumors and dark tourism. People from nearby towns would drive past its rusting gates, recounting the horror story of the Theragen poisoner, turning Evergreen into a ghostly figure for their children's bedtime warnings. Inside the scientific community, the Theragen scandal sent shockwaves of fear and shame. The lab's shutdown wasn't just a legal decision, it was a symbolic reckoning. Here was a stark reminder that scientific institutions, for all their prestige and claims of rigor, were not immune to catastrophic failings. "No one really thought it could happen to someone like us," said Dr. Emily Cartwright in an interview years later. "We believed we were too advanced, too careful. Evan proved us wrong." The victims carry the scars. For the victims of Evans' experiments, life was forever altered. Those who survived carried physical scars that acted as constant reminders of the nightmare they endured. Some had chronic neurological damage, tremors that made even simple tasks like writing or holding a cup unbearable. Others struggled with long-term organ damage, a direct result of the toxins Evan had so coldly engineered and administered. Jessica Hall, a former lab assistant who had been among the first to fall ill, described her ongoing battle with chronic fatigue and memory loss. "I can't remember what I had for breakfast most mornings," she said in a tearful interview. "I used to be sharp, I could sequence genes in my sleep. Now I can barely hold a thought." Yet for many, the emotional scars were even worse than the physical ones. The survivors struggled with paranoia and trust issues, haunted by the realization that someone they called a co-worker, a man they ate lunch with, shared small talk with, had seen them as nothing more than variables in his twisted experiments. "You think back to every interaction," said Patrick Eng, a Theragen IT staff member who suffered partial paralysis. "Every smile, every word. You wonder, was he studying me? Was he watching? I don't think I'll ever trust someone at face value again." The families of those who didn't survive bore the heaviest burdens. Robert Tully's widow Marie spoke out frequently in the years following Evans' trial. "They called it science," she said bitterly during a televised interview. "But what he did wasn't science, it was cruelty, pure and simple." Despite their heartbreak, many families worked tirelessly to ensure the tragedy wasn't forgotten. They formed advocacy groups, lobbied for stricter regulations in labs, and pressed for universal tox screening in corporate environments. "If we don't learn from this," Marie Tully remarked at a memorial event, "then what's to stop the next Evergreen? The public shock and outrage." The Theragen scandal captured national attention, dominating headlines for months. Late-night talk show hosts joked darkly about the quiet chemist, while true crime podcasts dissected every chilling detail about Evans' life, his motives, and his unheard-of methodical cruelty. But for the public, the story soon became about much more than a criminal case. It became a lightning rod for debates over corporate accountability, government oversight, and the limitations of human ethics. "How did someone like Evergreen even get hired in the first place?" demanded one anchor during a heated televised debate. "Where were the background checks? Where were the safety protocols?" In the wake of public outrage, government agencies scrambled to respond. Safety inspections became more frequent. Labs across the country were subjected to surprise audits. The EPA and OSHA introduced sweeping reforms on chemical inventory tracking, while the FDA demanded stricter ethical clearance for experimental work. These changes may have arrived too late for Theragen's victims, but they became part of the legacy left in the disaster's wake. Still, many critics argued that the damage had already been done. "This isn't just about one man," said investigative journalist Jenna Alvarez. "It's about an entire system built on secrecy and profit where the people at the bottom, the workers, are just disposable pawns." Evergreen, monster or reflection? With Evergreen imprisoned for life, his name became synonymous with cruelty and cold calculation. Yet for some, his story posed unsettling questions. How had society allowed him to thrive for so long? How many other Evans might be lurking in labs around the world, unnoticed because they played by the rules just well enough to slip through the cracks? Psychologist Dr. Susan Partridge, who observed Evan during his trial, often spoke about how his detachment blurred the lines between genius and sociopathy. Evan wasn't obvious, she said in an interview years later. He wasn't the caricature of a villain. He was just competent, quiet, and willing to trade morality for curiosity. The most chilling realization, one that Dr. Partridge and many others came to, was that Evan's crimes might not actually be as unique as they first seemed. He was, in many ways, the product of an environment that rewarded ambition while ignoring ethical gray areas. And as long as those conditions remained unchanged, the possibility of another Evan Green couldn't be ruled out. A town that would never forget. For the people of Evergreen, Theragen's collapse marked the end of an era. The lab had once been a badge of pride for the small Montana town, a shining example of progress tucked into the stillness of rural America. But after Evan's crimes, it became a stain on their history. "People don't talk about Evergreen without mentioning Evan Green," remarked a local diner owner. "That's what we're known for now, not the mountains, not the river, him." It wasn't just the lab that disappeared. The scandal gutted Evergreen's economy, driving away investment and leaving behind an air of suspicion. Families who had lived there for generations moved away, unwilling to raise their children in a place tainted by such profound tragedy. Yet in some quiet corners of Evergreen, there were whispers about redemption. Some residents began organizing community events and town hall meetings to reclaim their home's identity. Fundraisers were started to support the victims' families, and to install educational programs for young scientists in local schools. "We can't erase what happened," said one organizer, "but we can try to move forward." The nation's final question. By the time the mainstream media moved on, one haunting question remained. Could this happen again? Evan Green had exploited a fragile system, but for all the safeguards that were implemented after his crimes, no one could say with absolute certainty that they had fixed the deeper issue. There would always be blind spots, bureaucratic loopholes, unchecked ambition, and perhaps most dangerously, the quiet, unassuming figures capable of slipping through unnoticed. For those who survived Evan's twisted world, moving on would never truly be possible. Every poisoned sip of water, every lab report marked with abnormalities, every memory of Evan's cold stare would remain burned into their minds, and for everyone else, the regulators, the corporate leaders, the public, it was a stark reminder of how quickly something safe, trusted, and ordinary could descend into horror. The ghost of Evan Green would linger not just in Evergreen but everywhere. The final lessons. For generations, the story of Evan Green, the Theragen poisoner, would be studied, debated, and dissected, not just as a cautionary tale about an individual's capacity for depravity, but as a chilling reminder of systemic failures and the hidden consequences of unchecked ambition. From the small town of Evergreen to the highest levels of academic and corporate institutions, the fallout from Green's crimes forced humanity to confront questions about morality, oversight, and just how fragile the veil of trust truly is in the spaces where progress and innovation thrive. Beyond the horror and heartbreak, Evan's story left no shortage of lessons. But as the years unfolded, the question remained, would anyone truly listen? Lesson 1. The question of trust. For those who survived Theragen's collapse, the scars left behind went beyond physical pain. They spoke to something far deeper, the betrayal of trust. Co-workers who once shared coffee and collaboration realized they had been unwitting participants in Green's perverse experiments. How could such an intelligent, outwardly mild-mannered man have hidden his dark intentions so well? What subtle cues had been missed? And more importantly, would they ever truly be able to trust again? Victoria Hall, one of the few Theragen employees to narrowly escape direct exposure, spoke about her ongoing paranoia in an interview years later. "I can't even sit in an office break room anymore without sizing up every single person in there. Are they hiding something? Could they be pretending? We always think monsters look obvious. Turns out they just blend in." The Theragen disaster became a crushing indictment of blind reliance on credentials and surface-level appearances. Evan Green was the kind of person people trusted, qualified, quiet, and seemingly harmless. But in hindsight, his detachment, his unwillingness to form connections, and his quiet precision were all signs of something far darker beneath the surface. "This isn't just about Evan Green," said Dr. Susan Partridge, a forensic psychologist who analyzed Green's case. It's about how society conditions us to trust what's polished and to overlook the uneasy feelings we can't quite explain. This trust isn't just placed in people, it's placed in systems, and sometimes those systems fail us. Lesson 2. Oversight can't afford complacency. If there was one takeaway from the fallout of Theragen, it was that oversight, both personal and institutional, had failed at nearly every level. Local investigations revealed a series of missed opportunities to stop Evergreen long before his crimes reached their brutal peak. When former employers were interviewed, the phrase, "we had no idea," became a concerning refrain. Forensic reviews highlighted years' worth of ignored red flags, unaccounted for chemicals at other laboratories, anonymous complaints reporting Evans' obsessive after-hours experiments, and inconsistencies in inventory audits. Even Theragen, a company that prided itself on rigorous safety protocols, demonstrated fatal negligence. Internal memos showed that lab managers had dismissed concerns about missing substances and unusual behavior as bureaucratic inefficiencies, and while some whistleblowers did come forward, their concerns were swept under the rug by higher-ups trying to protect the lab's pristine reputation. "I reported it twice," said one anonymous former Theragen employee. "The missing supplies, the discrepancies in the logs, it wasn't normal, but I guess management thought it was easier to ignore it than investigate it. Turns out that decision cost lives." Evergreen's case became a rallying cry for reform, resulting in sweeping policy changes across multiple industries. On paper, regulations grew stricter. Comprehensive background checks became mandatory for lab hires, inventory tracking systems were overhauled, and surprise federal audits were introduced. But as years passed, some critics questioned if these efforts went far enough, or if they were more about optics than true accountability. Lesson 3. The ethics of ambition. The Theragen scandal forced the scientific community to take a hard look in the mirror. For all its groundbreaking discoveries, could the culture of innovation have its own blind spots? Was the pursuit of innovation sometimes treated as more important than the people affected by it? Evans' journal, a chilling manifesto detailing his so-called experiments, became a key artifact in debates about scientific ambition gone awry. While his actions were clearly criminal, his fixation on discovery at any cost tapped into broader, uncomfortable questions about the nature of science itself. "The line between curiosity and cruelty has always been thin," said Jenna Morrison, an ethics professor who used Green's case in her lectures. "The greatest breakthroughs often come from those willing to test limits, but what happens when those limits are crossed deliberately? And how do we tell who's chasing discovery for the good of humanity versus those chasing it for themselves?" One particularly haunting quote from Evans' journal captured his warped justification for his crimes. "Every great scientist in history understood the sacrifice required. Experimentation is not about what's comfortable, it's about what's possible. Pain, loss, chaos, they are simply the price of progress." This statement sparked fervent debates around the globe. Green's words raised unsettling parallels to historical cases where ethical boundaries had been crossed in the name of research. "The truth is, Evans' thinking wasn't as unique as we'd like to believe," Morrison continued. "We've seen this logic before in dark chapters of history, from unethical human trials to suppressed lab accidents. The question now is, how do we ensure those chapters stay closed?" Lesson 4. Communities bear the consequences. The collapse of Theragen Labs was far from a contained tragedy. For the small town of Evergreen, Montana, the scandal was nothing short of an economic and social disaster. What had once been the town's shining jewel, a biotech facility promising jobs and progress, was now a lasting scar. After the trial, Evergreen became a ghost town. The closure of Theragen left hundreds unemployed, and the toxic reputation surrounding the scandal drove away business opportunities, tourism, and even residents. Families that had lived in the area for generations packed up and left. Those who stayed spoke of how the name Evergreen had become synonymous with Evergreen's crimes, turning their quiet town into nothing more than a morbid punchline for late-night talk show hosts. "We lost more than jobs," said Rachel Carter, a former Evergreen schoolteacher who watched her town dwindle. "We lost who we were. Theragen was supposed to be a symbol of how this little place could change the world. Instead, it destroyed us." Yet even in devastation, some sought redemption. A grassroots group of Evergreen locals began organizing memorials for the victims and rebuilding their community. They established scholarships in the names of the employees lost in the outbreak, calling for future generations to learn from the mistakes of the past. Lesson 5. Monsters are made, not born. As more came to light about Evergreen's upbringing and education, one uncomfortable truth became clear: his descent into darkness wasn't born in a vacuum. The broken family, the unchecked ambition, the absence of mentorship and accountability, all were pieces of a larger puzzle. Evergreen had been failed at every stage of his life, as a child, as a student, and as a professional. "This doesn't excuse what he did," noted Dr. Susan Partridge during one interview. "But if we continue ignoring the conditions that foster people like Evergreen, relentless pressure, lack of oversight, glorification of genius without ethics, then it will happen again." Psychologists and scientists began using Green's case to push for systemic change, not just in hiring practices but in education systems, corporate environments, and even parenting approaches. There was a growing movement to emphasize ethics, empathy, and emotional intelligence alongside traditional markers of brilliance. Final reflections. The Evergreen tragedy forced humanity to grapple with its own blind spots. It wasn't just about one man, it was about the cracks in the systems that placed trust above skepticism, convenience above caution, and ambition above humanity. As the years passed, the world slowly tried to rebuild the safeguards it had overlooked. Policies tightened, technologies improved, and conversations around the ethics of science grew louder. But for the victims, the wounds never fully healed. Evelyn Tully, granddaughter of Robert Tully, later wrote in her memoir, "What happened at Theragen wasn't just about ignoring the truth, it was about ignoring people. We all just wanted to believe we'd be safe. We all just wanted to believe everyone there had hearts as good as their minds. And maybe if we'd stopped looking the other way, we could have saved a few more lives." Ultimately, the final lesson of Theragen echoed through science, society, and small-town America. Trust without accountability is dangerous, and no one, not even the quiet ones, should ever go unnoticed.